Well, I just want to thank you guys for being here. This is this Lunch and Learn, Sharon with Sharon. She loves the name, by the way. I think episode 3 here. It's brought to you by the Standards and Image Committee. My name is Kendra and my co-chair, Amanda Yagi. We chair that committee. And just a plug too, these lunch and learns come from the conversations that we have in the Standards and Image Committee. And we'd love for you guys to be part of that conversation as well. So our next meeting is right here in this room, November 20th at 10 a.m. We'd love for you guys to be there and continue the conversation. Just a few little things before we kind of talk about what we're going to do here today. You guys have some goodies in front of you. So some Use a Realtor sunglasses here. We are actually participating in the Junior Achievement Career Fair for local 8th graders. And that is going to be here coming up in the next week. Can someone remind me of the dates? Yeah. Yeah, what's your second? Sorry, the day. It is the 14th and 15th of November. Yeah, so we're gonna be passing these out to local 8th graders so they can remind their parents. But we also are looking for some volunteers still for that as well. So if that would be something you guys are interested in, we need help with setting up. We play games that are real estate related with the 8th graders to help them learn the process of purchasing real estate. And then we'll need help breaking down as well. So if that sounds like it's something of interest of you, please reach out to Faith or any of the staff and we'll get you guys signed up for that. Sorry, go ahead. 2 or 3 hour shifts, right?
Oh,
Yeah, and it flies by too.
2.5 hours in total.
Yeah, flies by. So lots of fun, lots of interaction. Another plug-in we want to do is Habitat for Humanity. We have another volunteer opportunity for that.
That is November 8th. It is at the warehouse, 3625 Mississippi Avenue in Davenport from 8 to 3:30.
So the only open spots though are 11 to 3:30 and we have quite a few open, so.
And am I correct in saying if they can only make it for a portion of that time, they're
Yeah.
still, even if you only have a couple hours within that 4-hour window, please reach out.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. We also have these what looks like these blue little things are booties. So enjoy. There's more. So again, thank you guys for coming. We really appreciate it. In front of you, there's a lot of paperwork. Sharon is going to go over all of it. But again, as I said, you know, we talk a lot in our Standards and Image Committee about what's going on, kind of the pain points within our industry. And obviously the changes recently with compensation, huge pain point. Misunderstandings out there, resulting in hard disagreements. And we want to make sure as a local association, we can do what we can do to clear everything up. So we spoke of having a roadmap originally. So you're gonna kind of see this page here, and we're actually going to kind of have a demonstration as to how that will actually work, and Sharon will talk through that. But then just some other things, how the money flows. Again, Sharon's gonna go through all these. Compensation models. Just a reminder, there is multiple ways of how you can list a home and determine the compensation for those involved, and then also just some terms. So obviously with these changes in our industry, we are resurfacing some vocabulary that we maybe need to freshen up on. So again, we'll touch base on all these. There's also some addendums we're going to be talking about as well. So this is gonna be a good one. Please feel free to ask questions. There will be some requests for crowd participation here in a little bit as well. So anything else? All right, well, with no further ado, the star of the show, Sharon's turn.
Thank you all. And we do have some people on Zoom. It's just distracting if you can see it, so they can see you and they can see all of us. I appreciate everybody coming. People that come to these things, that read stuff that we send out, that read stuff that comes out of your state association and national association, things from your brokerage. If you're staying engaged, you're gonna win, right? It's if you are not engaged and you're trying to just work through some of these differences and processes, that's when it's going to be a problem. We used to always say, you know what, if you're seasoned, you know everything. I actually think our new agents have a leg up here because they are going to be only doing things going forward and not always looking back and going, "Ah, that's the way I like the way it used to be." Well, you know what? Used to be is gone. And well, I will maybe say, used to be maybe gone. November 26th will be kind of our deciding date. That is when the court is going to be looking at the NAR settlement and deciding whether or not to accept that settlement. So if we get to November 26th and the court will not accept it, I have no idea what changes will be made. So we are going with what we've got today. And you know what? Making it work for the clients. I'm gonna start, and I know it said horror stories, and most of the horror stories that I have are confidentially filed away in my brain. But I'm gonna talk a little bit, kind of sounds like a joke here. I had a lender, a lawyer, and a closing agent walk into my office last week. Except for in reality, they did. And I'm not quite sure. I do get that there is a change in our industry, but some of the things that are happening, on the road to closing have not changed. Not getting addendums, not getting invoices, not getting basic math correct on commission statements. That's always been, but it is escalated with this change in our industry. They estimated to me that they're 30% of the closings that they have been doing, and these are houses that do quite a lot of our real estate, are being delayed because of the lack of the information they need or correct information. So that's buyers and sellers being delayed in their closings. And it's probably higher than that, because they are having to work, to call, to look for things, to try and figure out math. And the other night I had someone call me, it was quite late, closing agent, and they were working on a file, and she said that when you put all the compensation together, it was a really funky amount. And she said, I've never seen that before. Not that it couldn't. And so she called up the buyer's agent and says, what kind of compensation are you getting and who's paying for it? And well, it's this, and the seller is paying for it, right? An hour later called up and said, oh, no, it's this, and the buyer is paying for it. The lender had no idea the buyer was paying this. So that in itself is going to be a huge problem, right? So you know what the comment was? That's okay. They can just pay it out of closing. Does anybody think there's a problem with that? No, I mean, you all might say there's a problem, but they say they are hearing this at the closing table. If, a compensation isn't right. Oh, well, no, you shorted me this. We'll just pay it out of closing. These attorneys and closing agents are signing, if it's a government loan, they're signing that there are no other deals that are existing outside of this closing document. They're not going to sign it anymore. You're not going to get paid. A closing can't be delayed or stopped because you're not getting your compensation, right? So the closing's gonna happen, you guys just aren't gonna pay, money's gonna be dispersed and you're gonna be out money. And you're gonna have to go at it a different way. So we all have to sing the song to those people around us that aren't here or that aren't, on Zoom. We have to take a moment. We have to check our math. We have to make sure that all parties to the transaction, which include, the lenders and the closing agents and everybody else that you need involved, understands what the figures are, where the money's coming from. Yes, the easy button is gone, right? the easy button where the majority of the transactions have come from, well, buyer broker compensation, the seller's gonna pay it, it all comes out that way. It's all coming from one location, right? So of course, the math is gonna be right. Now we have to make sure that our math from different places. And if you're here, you are probably the quad, right? You are making sure that your transactions are good and you're making sure of everything. But there's someone else on the other side of the transaction and you need to be communicating with them to make sure that both parties are being of the transaction are being serviced in the way that they should be. Your code of ethics says that you treat everyone honestly, you work for everyone. Of course, your client is your client, but you must treat everyone else in the transaction, honestly, and you must work to make sure that this transaction, because ultimately you guys don't get paid, right? If it doesn't close. And the closings that are being delayed are delaying other closings and are delaying other closings and other closings. And, that's not what we want out there. The public is having some issues with us anyway. So we're gonna start with these two little things. And actually, sometimes when I get stuff from the National Association, it's so generic, or it actually doesn't necessarily work in our market. But these are two really good little things, the do's and don'ts when working with buyers and sellers. And the thing that's really nice, the thing that's really kind of nice about this is it's really in plain English, right? So read through this, give it to your managing brokers. If you are a managing broker, copy them, send them out to your people, because it is very, very, clearly and frequently demonstrate your value. Explain what a written buyer's agreement is. So talking about buyer's agreements, right? Are you sitting down? Are they really understanding this is a legal binding document? Are they understanding that they are not supposed to be signing another one with someone else, right? Or are you making sure that they haven't signed one with someone else? Are you making sure that you're not encouraging them to sign one with you when someone else, they already have one? Because that's agency. So that's just like knocking on a door of a seller and saying, why don't you sign a new listing contract? We would never do that, right? Well, you can't do it with a buyer agreement either. And I do know that there are agents, there are members of our association that are telling people that it is okay. And that if you sign another one, it just supersedes that one, right? That is wrong. You can't talk to that person. It's just like, a seller can call you when they're under, a listing contract, and you can tell them what your services are, but you really can't, solicit their business. You can't do that with a buyer agreement either. Now, that's an exclusive buyer agency agreement, right? We don't supply a non-exclusive, just like we don't supply a non-exclusive listing contract, because we think that you should be working as an exclusive agent. But I had new member orientation, and these are little horror stories, right? In the middle of things. So new member orientation, and this one person sat there all day, had sat through George's class, ethics class, had sat through my whole spiel, and in the end, she did not understand that she couldn't sign another one because she had been told by a very seasoned agent that it doesn't make any difference if they sign 10 of them. They just will keep superseding each other. Do you want to operate in that kind of a world?
Bless you.
Anybody? No. No. So we need to make sure that if you hear something like that in your office, or if someone says something, that you say, no, that's wrong, right? These are legal binding contracts. So, explaining it to them so they know what it is. Electronics signatures and electronic documents. Oh, those are so nice and easy, but do people fully understand, what they are signing? The potential costs of a buyer agreement, and don't misrepresent something to a buyer, right? Don't accept more compensation that is provided. Don't share your buyer agreement with anyone. So that's another one that I get, is the listing agents asking the buyer agent for their buyer representation agreement. If a listing agent asks you that, just turn around and say, well, then you can send me your listing contract. Right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't do that. Buyer agreements are brokerage agreements, right? They have to be kept. I'm sure all the managing brokers are making sure that they are keeping copies of all of that for the length of time. And, don't ask for copies, don't send copies. And then, with the sellers and buyers, just read through these. I think it's a lot of good information. Kendra talked about the terms. These are just a few terms some of the people on the committee have sent, and these are very generic, glossary definition of some of the easy stuff, right? What's the difference between an amendment and an addendum? If you interchange those two in your talking or in your verbiage, there is probably, I'm taking it from Mike, there's probably no judge that's ever going to say you called it an amendment and not an addendum, and so it's not legal, right? But we try and at least, if you divide that off, amendment is a change and addendum is, adding something, it kind of keeps it a little bit straighter in your mind as to what you're doing, right? So we have addendums. We now have 13 addendums to our purchase agreement. What an agreement is, broker to broker compensation, co-op compensation, or BBC, all means the same thing, right? Broker to broker compensation. Broker to broker agreement, and that's what you use to memorialize a broker to broker agreement, compensation, closing costs, exclusive buyer representation agreement, gross purchase price, and that's what we use as far as our listing contracts and anything else that we use, we base it on gross purchase price, not net. Used to be, we required you to disclose it in the remarks, agent remarks, if you were not paying compensation on concessions. Right? That can no longer be in the remarks. There can be no reference to compensation at all. So if in your brokerage, in your business, you are not paying on the gross purchase price, you need to make sure that you are communicating that. Right? However you would communicate that, but not in the MLS. We are taking them out when we find them. We search it every day. So we are finding less and less, but just don't. An IPC concession, that's interested party contributions, and that are your closing costs, your prepaids, those kind of things. Those, of course, count against or in the ratio that a buyer can borrow. Your buyer broker compensation is not an IPC, so it does not count in that ratio amount where a buyer can borrow money. Net purchase price, of course, that's minus all of those fees, seller paid concessions, and then a seller net sheet. So probably all know these terms, but I think some people have forgotten what these terms. So we decided that we would give that to you. This is kind of a good consumer guide from the National Association, and it's offers of compensation, and it really is just definitions on what offers of compensation, and that there are different compensation models. And going back to that, most of the disputes that I have been heard about since August 17th are that one company policy, they have one, form of compensation that they're gonna do, another has a form of compensation they wanna do, and that, they're at odds, but they shouldn't be, because you can't dictate what another company policy is, and they can't dictate what your policy. What you do is need to figure out how to work through the process, right? So the company offers broker compensation on the list side, and they're offering it to you on the buy side, and your company does not offer out BBC if on their listings. That doesn't mean that you don't accept the buyer broker compensation, because in your in our exclusive right to represent buyer contract, it states broker shall use best efforts to cause the seller or seller's agent to satisfy the buyer's obligation to broker under this subsection. So if you are using our buyer representation agreement, or most buyer representation agreements have that, and you are bringing the buyer and the listing company is offering you broker to broker compensation, you say, I don't want that, we're going to, put it in and get the seller to pay it, you have really just violated the EBA, right? Because you have now taken what is being offered to you and put it as a negotiation, which your buyer then might not get, right? The BBC might not be enough, and then you have to, go into it, but just to say point blank, we're not gonna accept it, you keep it and expect the seller to negotiate it, they don't have to. And just because they offer it as, on, it's being offered on the listing contract doesn't mean that they still have to offer it in the purchase agreement, right? So you need to be real sure of what you are saying if you are deciding that you are not going to accept that you are, just because your company policy is different than another company policy. You're both working, sometimes you have, I do realize some of you just work with buyers, some work with sellers, but for the most part, you work with both, right? And so doing your business differently, if you have one side or the other, you need to make sure that you're thinking through the processes and how best to serve that client at that time, right? All right, then we're gonna not do the addendum for a minute. So I was tasked by the committee to put together some roadmaps or a roadmap. And Faith and I just got a little crazy. So, people are different learners. You can add to these, right? If you think of other things that you would like to put under this, but these are just compensation models, right? Buyer pays, that's pretty darn easy. Fits in the buyer agreement, and the buyer, says, well, I'm gonna pay that. That's pretty darn easy, right? They're gonna pay you. Broker to broker or seller direct pay or any combination. So this is one way. And it tells a little bit on here about, what is entailed on there. This is, I think, the simplest one, right? If it's broker to broker, it goes from the seller to the listing broker, and the listing broker pays the buyer broker, right? If the seller pays, it goes from the seller to the buyer broker. And if the buyer pays, it goes from the buyer to the buyer broker. Pretty darn easy, right? And then this one. I think this is the fun. This is the little roadmap. So we start here with signing our buyer representation agreement. Then we show property, not the other way around, right? We know. Has anybody run into that yet? A buyer saying they never had to sign one of these before? And they just saw property like last week?
Oh, no.
If they saw property before August 17th, or in Iowa before July 1, they wouldn't have seen one. And then you have to explain to them that it is now law, right? So you sign it, you show the property, and when the buyer shows interest in the property, you know, wants to write on it or very interested and wants to really look at maybe numbers and that kind of thing, call the listing agent to determine if there's broker-to-broker compensation offered. That would be your first question, right? Because you need, before you write a purchase agreement, you need to know what money you're working with. Okay, so we're doing that. If the answer is yes, ask much, right? And if it's enough to satisfy your buyer obligation on the buyer representation agreement, sign a broker-to-broker compensation agreement and go to the finish line. If it's a no, if it's not enough, if the answer is no, or it's not enough to cover your obligation, you use addendum 13 of the purchase agreement, concessions and buyer broker compensation for your buyer to request that the seller pay some or all of your obligation. And then we go down here, and then it's enough, and we're gonna go to closing. Right? We just walk through it. So. Yay. I need 2 people. Who wants to come up? 2 people.
It'll be fun.
It's not, there's handy, it's a safe, yeah, it's a safe zone. Okay. All right. I got 2 people. Yay. Okay. So. Oh, seriously. Okay, who's the buyer agent? Who's the buyer? Okay.
I like this.
So you're gonna need an exclusive buyer agent agreement, right?
Yep.
You're gonna have them her sign it, right?
Yes,
You're gonna explain it and you're gonna have her sign it, and
absolutely.
she's gonna do what? She's gonna say, you know what? I've got a bunch of cash.
Oh, right.
Maybe I won't.
So this is when the buyer pays, right? So you've signed it. You like the amount, you're ready to purchase a house. And you decide that you're just gonna pay her off.
Okay,
And you hand her a bunch of money
there you go. Perfect.
and you take it to your broker.
Yes.
All right?
Is this before the closing?
No, it's at closing.
Okay.
Wow.
I was gonna say.
Yeah. We have that retainer fee.
So yes, now on the buyer agreement, and that is something that you're gonna have to talk over with your broker because we have the deposit or retainer fee. And that your broker probably would be fine with because remember, all money has to go through them. The second one, where you're paying like per showing or per week or per, something, you have to talk to your broker about that. Because they may not want to get into a situation where you're like bringing them $50. And they're figuring out to split on that or $50, that kind of thing. So that's something that you need to talk to your broker and we are going to be redoing the buyer agreement. Pretty much it'll all say the same, but it'll be better words. So that's that.
Buyer's paying.
Yeah. So now I need one more person. 2 more people. I need 2 more people. Okay.
I say, don't everybody jump.
Okay, you want to be the seller? You want to be the seller? And then you'll be the selling agent, right? So the seller comes over here,
Oh, sorry.
right?
The dance, I think.
It is a dance. So the buyer and the buyer's agent have written this agreement. And they've looked at a house and you love this house. So now the buyer agent is gonna call the selling agent and ask if there is
a co-op compensation being offered, or is the seller offering any compensation
And I'm
for
going to
buyer's agent.
say,
You want to ask if there's broker to
To broker,
broker compensation, because your seller may have said, I'd be willing to entertain it, but that would be in the purchase agreement. So you want to make sure that you are using the proper terms, right?
Is there a BDC on this property?
yes, okay, yes. Over my script.
You don't have
Yeah.
And then the next question is,
How much?
X.
Awesome.
and you look at your
Yeah, that's
agreement,
Yes.
and X covers it. So, so we are going to start over on this side. And the seller has authorized this bag of money. And then out of that bag of money, a little baby money is then going to be paid. That buyer broker compensation will now go, and it will be a part of this. See, the seller didn't hand it, right? The seller authorized it on the listing contract. A bag of money, and out of that bag of money, that bag of money, right?
And that is memorialized with the broker to broker.
That is memorialized with the broker to broker.
Yes.
Now. Everybody just stay right here. You got your bag of money, you got your bag of money. That is not enough for you, right?
It is pretty small.
It is pretty small. So now, what are you gonna do?
Talk to my buyer first and ask her if she would like to ask the seller to include it in their offer, or if she has all this money, does she wanna pay?
Yep. She could hand you the remainder. I got the money, I'll just cover it.
Perfect.
Yeah. Or I have part of that money, and here it is, but we're also gonna wanna use our addendum number 13, right? To ask for the seller to pay
Mhm.
the remainder,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And so you're going to take the addendum, and you're gonna ask the seller.
Through
your
agent.
Yes, your buyer is going to be doing that through you. So
Yes.
you guys together are doing
Okay.
that. Is going to ask the seller.
The seller or through
Through
her
the
agent?
agent.
We would like X more apples, please.
Do you want to provide X more apples to sell your house today?
that. So
Sure.
you would then at closing, pay
Great.
the buyer's agent.
Now that's much better.
Now, now she has that.
All right. And I think this is on that sheet
It
that
is
you
on
want
that.
people to give
Yeah,
the cover sheet.
yes, yes.
You could have three people,
Yes.
three different people pay
Yeah,
your.
so if you pull out this with the highlighted, so the lawyer, the lender, the lawyer, and the closing agent, though we have had this, have never seen this. None of them have ever seen it on a deal. I would like that to become part, and if you don't, your company may have something, but let's make sure that it's all of these things are being sent to the lender, okay? Just so that that this is a part of the purchase agreement, so that a cover sheet or your cover email or whatever you do, but make sure these elements are in there. Okay, do we cover them all?
I have seen a little bit of confusion in the second scenario where there is broker to broker compensation being offered. Who, is it the listing agent or the buyer's agent that is supposed to be after it's been?
Oh.
asked?
Okay,
Who's supposed to be saying what and do?
okay. Both of you can take your broker to broker compensation agreements and plaster them all over the Quad Cities. And disperse them any way you want, and you can send them to other people. The one thing that you need to know as a buyer's agent, you are the one that needs to make sure that one is signed. The listing agent, the seller's agent, the listing agent already knows in the listing contract they're getting paid. If it's broker to broker, there is nothing that memorializes anymore. We took the compensation, the blanket offer out of the MLS. That bound it. There is no memorialization. So whoever sends it to who, and it doesn't really make a difference, but it's the buyer's agent that needs to make sure that there is one, right? So talk to your companies, I mean, you only have to sign one, but you need to make sure that buyer's agent needs to make sure there is one. Right? So I'm not gonna, the association doesn't take, we don't set policy. But we just look at what needs to be done. And the buyer's agent is the one that needs it. So, yes, go ahead.
I don't know if this is the right time, but I think it would be a good idea to talk about and clarify the history of how agents get paid through attorneys and title companies. In regards to historically.
Yeah.
Do you know where I'm going with this?
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about that actually when we talk about the addendum.
Perfect.
Okay.
thank you.
All right, so is anybody want to see this again?
I think they need to wear them the rest of it.
There's a bowl of candy behind you.
Yeah, we got it.
You want more cookies?
Yes.
Yes, I love
Yeah.
it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So let's go down through this form just a little bit, this cover sheet. And probably most of you have a template of an email or some kind of a cover sheet, or your brokerage has something that goes over with a lot of this information, but they need this information. This came out of a lender meeting, that they say they really need this information, but we did not have, tenant occupied. That's important to a lender, right? To find out at the last minute that it's tenant occupied and all of that decisions and paperwork have not been done. So we have added that. Also earnest money amount and being held by who? Interestingly enough, I was told that most of them don't look at the page that it's on in the purchase agreement because that's there, but this will just highlight to make sure, because different people are holding earnest money now. All that traditionally used to happen does not happen anymore. And that's been for a number of years. So, but if we go up here, we have who's the seller, who's the buyer, what's the property, the seller's agent, seller's attorney, buyer's agent, buyer's attorney, compensation paid to. I mean, if you're the buyer's agent, you probably aren't gonna have that, but that's okay. But what you really need to do is make sure the total compensation paid to the buyer broker is whatever, and then break it out so that they know. Because these lenders are finding out way late that their buyers are bringing money to the table, right? You should be sending the buyer representation agreements to the lender quickly if you have the buyer, so that they can see, how much that, whether or not your buyer can even really qualify, because, whether or not it counts as an IPC, it could still count. They just don't have the money to do it, right? So, unless the seller contributes to it. So, try and use this or something like this. Okay, did I miss any part of this? Okay. Okay, now we're gonna get to the good part.
It was just pointed out, there is a typo on there,
Yeah.
that's why it's still a draft, so I will get that fixed. It's on this highlighted one.
The listing broker motion.
Yes.
It's Halloween. That was-
Oh,
that was a-
actually, you know what? You guys are great to be here. Because this is like the first time the revised one of those, the cover sheet, and then this addendum number 13. This has not been open to the general membership public as yet. We just finalized it yesterday. So I wanted to make sure that you read through it. And if you see a typo or you see something that doesn't make sense, speak now, right? Yeah, so funny, not so funny. We had committee meetings, forms committee meetings, and we had like hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. Right after we put out the revised exclusive buyer agency agreement, two people from the committee call me up and say, you know, this stuff doesn't make sense. No. So look over it as we go over it. Now, this is an addendum. This was not, if this was being used with the purchase agreement, this was not being sent with the purchase agreement. So maybe by having it look like all the rest of the addendums, having a number and all that kind of thing, people won't understand. They have to put this on that page that says, are there any addendums? And you put that on that page and then you attach it to the purchase agreement. So this just exactly like it says for the other ones. And then this first one we have are your customary, buyer closing costs, those things, the prepaids, the insurance, all of that kind of thing. If you're, you can, there is no law that says you can't put it on page 2. And at some point, maybe we'll just get rid of the lines on page 2, but but we have it on an addendum. There's a reason to use this. You all, as real estate licensees, unless you're also an attorney, have to be very, very careful about language that you write into a contract. So by having this language, it helps you with your licensure, but it also makes sure that there's clear and concise language, right? So, subject to buyer's lender approval, seller shall contribute up to so much money or percentage of the gross sales price towards buyer's closing costs as a credit to the buyer. This could include, but is not limited to, loan application fees, appraisal, credit reports, attorney fees, title policy, title opinion, recording fees, discount points, origination fees, and or prepaids, including homeowners insurance, escrows, inspections, and down payment. Those are all the things that you might write in on page 2, right? So you might as well just write it in. Or have it there. Then we have our next big box, right, is all of the bottom part. So who all has ever used the VA/FHA addendum, right? It's got the boxes and you pick the one that you need to use and the rest of them you don't do anything with. This is kind of that same thing. You've got the buyer closing costs and then you have your buyer broker compensation. And to cover the buyer's obligation to pay buyer brokerage for the services provided to the buyer, both past and future regarding this property, the buyer brokerage shall be compensated at closing as is customary. Now, we always get, oh my gosh, that's why we're in this lawsuit, because of customary. No, the term and the use of that customary comes out of an industry letter from the government lenders, right? Because they use that as a term. This is how it is normally done. And so anything that's within that norm works for us. Anything outside the norm is something that we have to address differently. So that word is okay to use. And then just buyer brokerage name, right? So we know what buyer brokerage we're talking about, making sure. So we just put that in there. And then either or both of the following can be used. So if there is co-op compensation, so listen to me carefully. If there is not closing, if you're asking for closing costs, you can use this, right? If there is co-op compensation that satisfies the buyer's brokerage, then you can use your broker-to-broker compensation form and you would not need to fill all of this out. This is to be used if that does not cover and you are going to be using more, right? So buyer broker compensation to cover the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer brokerage for services provided to buyer, both past and future regarding this property, the buyer brokerage shall be compensated at closing as is customary. Now, read the same thing. Co-op compensation, broker to broker payment, listing brokerage will pay whatever of the gross price of whatever to buyer broker at the close of the transaction. Now, if this gets on there and you already have a broker to broker compensation and it's signed, that doesn't double it up. This is just a reaffirmation. But the real reason this would be on there is if it's not enough to fill it, and then you could use either or both, you would also use this seller direct pay and be asking for that additional. Or you just use the seller direct pay if there is no broker to broker compensation. So we have added in this co-op compensation, and the reason we did is what we're hearing is on the old addendum, which is the same addendum, people were writing in the co-op compensation anyway, right? Now, on the seller direct pay, amount to be in addition to the amount of the co-op compensation, if any, right? In addition to. Okay, at closing, seller shall pay of the gross price or what dollar amount to cover some or all of the buyer's obligation to the buyer brokerage agent, as is customary. We need to look at the math. After you write this all up, look at the math. Pull out another piece of paper and kind of start adding it up, right? Making sure that the math makes sense. The one that the closing agent, it was like 6.6%. It all added up to, and she said, that's just a funky amount, and it was, because it was wrong. So then the seller and the buyer pay or sign this, right? Because the purchase agreement is between the buyer and the seller. The buyer's agent, this is where you were getting at, right? Is a third-party beneficiary of this. And the reason why there should be a signature there is, so if you go back to, we are a realtor association. The Code of Ethics, Article 17 allows for arbitration of broker to broker disputes. That would cover the broker to broker compensation disputes. Seller paid direct pay is not covered under that arbitration. So that would mean that if the seller decided not to pay, right? They just said no, but you can't stop the closing. They're not paying the buyer broker obligation. Then the buyer, you would have to sue your buyer. And the buyer would be suing the seller. So as long as the third party, the selling agent says they're a third party, then the buyer's brokerage could sue the seller directly and not have to sue their buyer to sue the seller, which I don't know, suing your buyer probably would pretty much say referrals are not going to happen in the future, right? Does everybody understand why that would be on there? And so that's why it needs to. Now, we're going to read this bottom part because this is important. It's really small. Payment is subject to the buyer's lender approval if applicable and may not be more than the amount agreed to in the brokerage agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent. We all know that, right? You can't get paid more than what is on your buyer agreement. So putting 0 is probably not a real smart thing to do, but we've had people do that. Agent's gross sale price shall be the total sales price for the property, which shall not be reduced by any allowances, prepaids, or other concessions to the buyer or the buyer agent. That's where we're saying that we are dealing totally, our standard is gross purchase price. Anything to the out of that ordinary standard would have to be communicated and accepted by all parties. Okay, the seller's willingness and agreement to compensate the buyer's agent broker at closing does not create any type of exclusive duty, representation, relationship, or agency agreement between the seller and the buyer's agent broker. All parties understand that the buyer broker is a third-party beneficiary of this transaction. By signing this agreement, the parties acknowledge and warrant that they have the authority to make this agreement. The terms of this agreement shall match the purchase agreement to which this is connected, and by signing this agreement, all parties acknowledge they have read and understood this agreement and agree to its terms. Compensation is not set by law or rule and is fully negotiated. The reason it has in here that by signing this, all parties acknowledge and warrant they have authority to make this agreement. There are brokerages that say on your listing contracts, on anything else, that the managing broker or the sponsoring broker or the, whatever broker must sign it. Or they give authority to their agents to sign it, right? On a listing contract, on your buyer representation agreements and anything else. So if the agent signs this as a third party, they are warranting that they have the brokerage permission to do that. Right? So you need to check with your broker. I'm sure by now you all know whether or not you have the ability to sign, because you probably all signed a listing contract by now. And that, you would see that. Anybody find any real problem with this?
I have a clarification question.
Great.
I was under the understanding that say the buyer and seller agreed because the seller's not offering anything in listing agreement. And the buyer and seller agreed what the payment is to the buyer broker. You're saying if the seller decides to not pay at the end, that this can't be held up, even though it's an agreement between the buyer and seller?
Yep.
Not between the broker, not between the agents?
Yep.
Well. The buyer could, I mean, they've gotten. If it's signed between the,
I can't do it.
you can't do
But
it,
the
so
buyer can.
The buyer.
could, but the concern is. You're sitting at the closing table, the buyer's got their entire world in a van, ready to move in. And the seller. Who is now supposed to pay this buyer's agent was like, that buyer's agent really wasn't working on my behalf. And I don't like them because that buyer got this and that, or I have to pay a little extra at closing. You know what? I'm gonna direct the closing agent. Don't take that out of my side. Don't pay that person. The chances that buyer is gonna be like, hey, you know what? Let's cancel this closing and let's wait a couple of days so we get this figured out and I'll be homeless with my family and my 3 dogs. The buyer's gonna say.
By the river.
Yeah, exactly. The buyer's gonna say, you know what, let's close. Sorry, Damien.
But in the
That
scenario
sucks for
that they choose to hold it up, they can.
They could, sure.
If they're not in the scenario of
I mean,
homeless.
that would be just
But
like
it's-
the
okay.
seller
Yeah.
reaching anything else in the purchase agreement. Absolutely, but. We've seen a couple of situations where the seller refused to pay.
It's
Never seen a buyer
not
go.
likely to be
"No."
held up, but it can be by the buyer if they choose. to.
Yeah,
Okay.
because.
Yeah,
because
like an
we've-
investor or
we've-
something. they might.
we've jumped into a different scenario than normal in a purchase agreement. Purchase agreements always used to be just all the terms between a buyer and seller, and now we're throwing this buyer compensation buyer broker compensation into it, and so we just have to make sure that we're covering people, and we really, really, really don't want you to have to sue your buyer for the money, because that's your first line. So unless you have this sign, and this is another really good reason to use this form, right? To try and protect you and your sellers, or buyers and sellers and everybody else. What we got?
Can you clarify?
Oh, okay, so I didn't hit.
So what? No. So, well, maybe I might back up to that question though. So, there's a percentage and then there's a dollar amount with blanks. Can you specify how you're supposed to fill those out? I think there can be confusion there.
Yes.
Well, it's an and or, right? It's not a range, it's an and or. So you might want to use the dollar amount if you are only gonna want to pay on net, right? And then you figure out what the net would be, because, if you put a percentages, it's in on the gross. So if you, if they don't want to pay the entire, then you would put in a dollar amount, but it's an either or.
Yep, so just again, a clarification, and no point should both of them ever be filled out.
No.
Okay.
But then would a seller say, oh, it says X% or $0? I'm gonna say $0.
It says or, it has an or in there.
Put in NA.
Yeah. I would put
Yeah,
NA,
I'd say,
yeah.
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 Oh, yeah, I wouldn't probably leave a blank there, or put a zero in?
I wouldn't put in zero.
I wouldn't put it in zero, I put it
Put
in
it in
A.
A.
The seller can say, well, I want to pay $0.
Well, yeah, we'd all want to pay $0, but yeah, I would put in it. Yeah. What was your other question?
So I'm backing up to the arbitration question, and that did explain it, but just to kind of simple it more, even further. So historically, on a closing document, if the attorney or title company, has cut one check, correct? So not even historically, more
And they still
recently.
do.
So more recently,
Yeah.
or sorry, no,
You
I'm
want,
backing
you want
up.
me, you want me to
Yes,
explain?
yes, because you're the one that brought it up to me, and
Okay.
So years ago, before, well, there's a few in here that might have been right. That there used to be at closing a check that was cut to the listing brokerage. The listing brokerage would take that check back to their accounting department, and then hopefully in a reasonable amount of time, they would then cut a check to the buyer's agent. You know, and then you'd have to go and you'd have to go pick it up from that brokerage or wait until there was mail sometimes
So
between.
like our
brokerages.
diagram.
Yeah.
Big bag of money, little
And
bag of
and
money.
then, but timing wise, buyer's agents were like, why am I waiting around? What's going on? And so some closing company was like, you know what? To streamline this and get more buyer's agents who might be driving where closings are going to happen to come to us, we will, as a courtesy, we will split it and cut the checks right here at the closing table. And a bunch of buyer's agents were like, this is great. We're taking all our business to close at that place because now I don't have to wait 2 or 3 days.
What ago was this, Mike, when there was only one check?
20,
20?
yeah,
I'd
probably
say
about 20 years ago,
years.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, so then at that point, other closers were like, hey, well, we'll do it too. And so it just became commonplace as a courtesy to cut the 2 checks. And as it was coming out of closing, people were like, oh, the seller's always just been paid this. But in reality, even with that courtesy, if there was ever any disputes, no buyer's agent ever was like, oh, I didn't get paid enough, so I gotta go sue that seller. No, they always went after the listing agent and said, hey, my check wasn't enough. It's supposed to be on the gross and you're only paying me on the net, or whatever the issue was. The courtesy of the 2 checks was just purely by the closing companies, so that the buyer's agent didn't have to wait a couple of extra days.
I bring that up because I've heard in conversation, like, people will say, well, the seller's always historically paid, and that's not true. That's not true. We've come into a convenience, which has now confused us,
Right, right.
and some of us, yeah. So that's why I bring that up, so people understand the history of really what co-op compensation used to look like, and what attorneys and title companies have done, again, out of convenience, where that can kind of get confusing.
And so now moving forward, and that's where it is, and people are like, well, what's the difference? Why are we doing some co-op thing, seller? It's all the same thing. It is factually, legally, very different things. If it's co-op compensation and there's some kind of dispute, you can go to arbitration and everything. If it's seller direct pay, you as the buyer's agent no longer have the ability just to take the listing agent to arbitration and get it solved there. You call up that listing agent and say, hey, I didn't get paid enough. They're gonna be like, sucks for you. Call that seller, and then you'll say, well, can I have that seller's contact information because they sold the house, where are they moving to? And they'll be like, I can't violate confidentiality with my seller. Best of luck to you. And then you're gonna have to figure it out from there. So there are legal differences in the 2 approaches.
Thank you.
And right now, because I've heard from people, well, we can't do broker-to-broker compensation. Right now, today, broker-to-broker compensation is still very legal and very accepted form of compensation. It may be in the future, it may not be in the future. We don't know that, right? getting it out of a blanket offer, you know, and that, you know, you have to really talk and then, you know, look and find out transaction by transaction is, you know, probably helping the situation, but really, we don't know what November 26th. So interesting that they made it that week, but yeah, we'll see what happens. Anybody else? Okay, so I'm gonna tell you one horror story that is still just kind of,
There you go,
it
Jamie.
circles.
I mean, it's a horror story.
Yeah, you know, it's not a horror story about, you know, a property or something. I'm sure you guys will have some great horror stories. I have sat, you know, back in the day when Brian was still practicing, I, you know, sat in the truck a few times, you know, with my hand on 911, but you know, that's a whole different thing. But so, there was this agent and they wrote a purchase agreement for their buyer and submitted it to the listing agent. And, it didn't come, you know, the transaction didn't happen. The seller didn't accept it. So the buyer's agent decided that they wanted to buy the property. So they went back to their office and they took white out and that contract and whited stuff out and resubmitted the contract to the listing agent with all the whiteouts and written over. So that's one of the horror stories I think about. Anybody have a really good, we have a little time? Anybody have a good story? Good scary story? No scary stories? You guys are so lucky. You've never gone down in a basement that's.
I was in the basement with the guy sleeping after we had shown the whole entire house and we walked into the bedroom basement and he's just laying there sleeping.
Oh, at least he was sleeping.
Yes. He did wake up.
Okay.
This was when I first started. I was showing my cousin houses. Thank God it was my cousin. Anyway, we did go into the basement and it was him and his fiance. We saw a cat down there. I'm not a cat person, I'm allergic, but anyway, she wanted to go over the cat, so she went over to the cat. And then she goes, oh, there's another one over here under this little cabinet. And she was, you know, hissing at it and didn't move. And so she's like, oh my gosh, I think it's dead. It was a dead cat. And I called the listing agent when we were done. And I said, I don't know when the last time they've seen this cat, but it's a dead cat in the basement. He said, well, tell your buyer, if they want to put in an offer, we'll throw in a dead cat.
I knew that was coming.
Awesome. Dawn, what you got?
Bought a cat and.
Oh, yes, you can.
No.
It's all right. It was our deal together. It's all right.
I'll dumb it down. Had a house for sale and people had 5 cats. And one of them was a stray and had just came in the house and they didn't, flea proof it or whatever. So, wife moves to Florida, takes the cats. And we have the house for sale. We bring all our staging stuff in, whatever. The house gets sold. And I go over to do some stuff and I had capris and heels on and I'm like, oh my God, my legs are on fire. And I get in my car and there's fleas jumping. I know animals. I am not a cat person. I'm like, oh my God. And I had just put a bunch of like blankets and towels. And so now my car is infested with fleas. But it was like, we were like half infected, like a month down the road or something. So we called and apparently a little note about fleas, they will stay on their host animal until their feeding source is gone, and then they just attack anything that comes into them.
Nice.
So I was fine with more when I was there, but until the cats were gone, then they attacked me. And so then, we were like, well, we've got to get this place treated, like, this is a serious concern, so we hired a company to come in, and it was like $3,000 to treat this property. Because, just a little note about fleas, the nits, the eggs can be dormant for up to 9 months if they don't have 2 things, oxygen and vibration. That's what causes the nits to hatch. So this company had to come in and spray blah, 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 and then bring like vibration machines and vacuums. Okay, so then we call the buyer's agent. And we're like, okay, here's what's happening. House was infested, we didn't know. It was being treated. And you want to finish the story?
So my buyer was a bit concerned about this. She's very organic, natural, also had pets and a fresh baby, like fresh. And so she, yeah, fresh, like just that. And I mean, Dawn worked her butt off to make sure it was taken care of, but because my client chose to call the company and kind of rip apart, what chemicals are you using? I have a baby, and they kind of wouldn't necessarily like give her the answer she wanted, I feel like, so she got a bit sassy with
She
them.
stopped treatment.
Yeah, did they stop treatment? And
Yeah, she
then-
wanted it, cause it was like a 3-part process.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
And she's like, no, I don't want any more chemicals in the house. And so then it became a legal issue because what if that buyer couldn't buy the house? What if something happened and then we have an infested home? And this guy, the seller had already paid like
$1,000.
$2,000 for the 2 treatments that had happened or whatever. Now the company's on
They're all
pest
mad.
company's mad because they're like being caught in between.
And then she refused to close unless it was professionally cleaned with organic products. Oh, it was.
Wow.
And we didn't talk about this.
We just saw you were doing that, like you remember that. Sorry.
Well, you know, personally, I would have rather said, use whatever you want. I won't go in the house for a month, but get rid of the fleas. I got a fresh baby.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Fresh baby.
Fresh baby.
Fresh baby's way better.
Yeah, that was one. I'm so prejudice, right?
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I hope you,
You want us to wait before we use this?
nope, it's gonna go out in public today.
Yeah, okay, so all these forms. Are these
Everything
gonna
will
go
be-
out today?
Yeah, everything will
Okay.
be available
Yeah,
today.
so all of these will go out today, so keep an eye on your email, share them with all of your, with your brokerages, with your broker managers. I mean, I'm even suggesting to people, take a picture of this and have it in your phone. So then when you're having that phone call with that co-op agent and you guys are not coming to an agreement on like what the clarification is with the compensation, both of you can refer to this then rather than it's starting some unnecessary angst in a sense. So that's what I would encourage you guys, to do. So, I want to thank Sharon. Thank you so much for clarifying this. It's been a hurdle, and we're all in this together. Remember, please. And so I appreciate it. Thank you guys for being here, for having a seat at the table. It means you care about what you do and those that we serve. So really appreciate that too. So if you guys have any questions, please reach out. And we'll help to clarify anything we can.
Well, and I will tell you that with the standards and image, with the forms committee, Mike has been the facilitator on that. Our association would have had I'm smart, but I don't sell real estate. And we needed practitioners, people to really come together and get us through starting in about February till now, looking at all of this stuff and working together so that we can try and, help our industry within the Quad Cities. I will tell you that there are associations out there that are still operating in June or May. They are relying on whatever they can get together. They have not been proactive, but our membership has really stood up, and I appreciate that because this is something that could not be staffed, right? We do a lot, the staff does a lot. Thank you, staff. But this needed member involvement, and I so appreciated that. So thank you.
We appreciate you. All right. Thank you, everybody.